Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing supernatural mysteries ever documented in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can, challenging everything you thought you knew about fate, family, and the thin veil between coincidence and curse. We're about to delve into a mystery that spanned 3 generations of one Pennsylvania family, where a single photograph taken on what should have been a day of celebration defied all rational explanation and left a legacy so haunting that descendants still refuse to speak its name aloud. This is not folklore. This is not legend embellished by time. This is documented fact, verified by death certificates, newspaper archives, and the terrified testimonies of those who survived. It was the year 1911. The world stood on the precipice of modernity. The Titanic was under construction in Belfast, promising to be the unsinkable symbol of human achievement. In Mexico, revolution was tearing the country apart. China's Qing dynasty was breathing its last breaths. Technology was reshaping civilization. Electric lights were becoming common in cities. The first airplanes were taking flight, and a new invention was capturing the popular imagination: photography. But in the coal mining regions of western Pennsylvania, in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains, the situation was far more complicated. There, in towns carved from wilderness and sustained by the black blood of the earth, communities existed in a strange twilight, caught between the old superstitions brought from Europe and the relentless march of industrial progress. In the small mining town of Windham Hollow, a place you won't find on modern maps, swallowed as it was by the expansion of Pittsburgh's suburbs, the Kovalenko family was preparing for a celebration. 3 generations were gathering for the 70th birthday of the family patriarch, Joseph Kovalenko, a Ukrainian immigrant who had arrived in America 32 years earlier with nothing but calloused hands and impossible dreams. What happened that autumn day would set in motion a series of events so methodical, so precise in their horror, that even the most hardened skeptics would find their certainty shaken. This is the story of the photograph, the cursed photograph, and the 9 souls it claimed. To understand what happened to the Kovalenko family, you must first understand Windham Hollow in 1911. The town existed in a valley so deep and narrow that sunlight reached the main street for only 4 hours each day, even in summer. The surrounding mountains rose like the walls of a prison, their slopes covered in dense forests of oak and pine that had stood for centuries before the first European ever set foot on this continent. Between those peaks, fog gathered like something alive, rolling down into the valley each evening, thick enough to lose yourself in, heavy with the smell of coal smoke and damp earth. Windham Hollow was a company town, owned entirely by the Allegheny Mining Corporation. Every building, every home, every store existed at the pleasure of the company. The mine itself, the Black Seam Mine, as locals called it, burrowed deep into the mountain's heart, a network of tunnels that descended more than 800 feet below the surface. The coal extracted there was of exceptional quality, rich and dense, perfect for the steel mills that were transforming Pittsburgh into an industrial titan. But the mine was hungry. It consumed men the way it consumed timber supports and dynamite. Every month brought accidents: cave-ins, gas explosions, flooding. The company cemetery on the hill overlooking town held more than 300 graves, many of them for men who had never seen their 40th birthday. The miners who worked the Black Seam were a tapestry of the world's displaced. Ukrainians like Joseph Kovalenko, Poles, Italians, Hungarians, Irish, men who had crossed an ocean seeking opportunity and found instead a different kind of bondage. They spoke a dozen languages in the tunnels, but they all understood the same things: darkness, danger, and the weight of stone above their heads. These men brought with them the old beliefs, protective talismans hung in the mine shaft's horseshoes, crosses made of iron, small bags of salt and herbs. The Ukrainian miners whispered about domovoy, house spirits that could protect or punish. The Italians spoke of the malocchio, the evil eye that could curse a family line. The Irish warned of changelings and banshees, whose wails predicted death. The company managers dismissed such superstitions as immigrant foolishness, remnants of a backward past that education and prosperity would eventually eliminate. But in Windham Hollow, where death was as common as the fog, where men descended into darkness each morning, uncertain they would see daylight again, the old beliefs persisted. They had to, because sometimes rational explanations weren't enough to explain what happened in those deep, dark places beneath the earth. Joseph Kovalenko had arrived in America in 1879, a young man of 20, fleeing conscription in the Russian Empire. He had worked first in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, then moved to Windham Hollow when the mine opened in 1885. He was among the first miners hired, and over 26 years he had survived what many others had not. Joseph was a large man, even by the standards of miners, 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by decades of swinging a pickaxe. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by coal dust that had worked its way into every line and pore, creating a permanent shadow under his skin. His hands were massive, scarred, the knuckles swollen from too many impacts with stone, but his eyes pale blue, almost gray, held a sharpness that age had not dimmed. He had built a life in this valley, married Anna Petrenko in 1880, a woman from his home village who had made the journey to join him. Together they had raised 6 children in a cramped company house at the edge of town, 4 sons and 2 daughters who had survived past childhood, a blessing in a place where infant mortality was devastatingly high. By 1911, Joseph was a grandfather 9 times over. His children had married, mostly to other miners' children, creating an intricate web of family relationships that characterized tight, knit mining communities. He had worked long enough to earn a measure of respect, to be seen as someone who knew the mountain, who understood its moods and dangers. His 70th birthday on October 21st fell on a Saturday, one of the 2 days each week when the mine operated at reduced capacity. The family had been planning the celebration for months. Anna had been preparing food for days, traditional Ukrainian dishes that required hours of labor. Vareniki dumplings filled with potato and cheese, holubsty, cabbage rolls stuffed with rice and meat, kovbasa sausage that Joseph himself had made, following his father's recipe, dark rye bread, honey cakes sweetened with precious sugar. The celebration would be held at the family home, but it would spill out into the yard and the small meadow behind the house where wildflowers grew in defiance of the coal dust that settled on everything. Nearly 50 people were expected: family, friends, fellow miners, their wives and children. And there would be a photograph. This was special. Photography was still expensive, still somewhat rare in working-class communities. But Joseph's eldest son, Dimitro, had saved money for months to hire a professional photographer from Pittsburgh. It would be a family portrait, all 3 generations together, something to preserve this moment forever, something to remember. No one could have known that the photograph would become exactly that, a memorial, a death roster, a prophecy written in silver nitrate and light. October 21st, 1911, dawned cold and gray. Autumn had come early to the mountains that year. The trees on the surrounding slopes had already shed most of their leaves, creating a carpet of gold and rust, dread, that would soon be buried under the first snows. The morning air carried the bite of winter, sharp enough to make breath visible, cold enough to sting exposed skin. But the weather did nothing to dampen the celebration. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the Kovalenko house was filled with activity. Anna commanded the kitchen like a general, directing her daughters-in-law in the preparation of food. The men gathered outside, smoking Han, rolled cigarettes and drinking Slivovitz plum brandy that Joseph had been aging in his cellar for 5 years, saving it for this occasion. Children ran through the house and yard, their laughter a sharp contrast to the usual summer atmosphere of the mining town. For one day, at least, there was joy. For one day, death and danger seemed far away. The photographer arrived at noon. His name was Samuel Whitmore, a thin man in his 40s with the precise, careful movements of someone who worked with delicate equipment. He had traveled from Pittsburgh by train and wagon, transporting his camera, a large-format view camera that required a tripod, along with glass plate negatives, chemical developing equipment, and all the other tools of his trade. According to the recollections of Elena Kovalenko, Joseph's youngest daughter, who was 18 at the time, Whitmore seemed nervous from the moment he arrived. He kept glancing at the sky, which had grown increasingly overcast, thick clouds moving in from the west. Natural light was essential for photography in that era, before reliable flash systems existed. If the clouds grew too thick, the photograph would be impossible. "We must hurry," he told the family. "The light is fading." They assembled in front of the house, in the small yard where Anna grew vegetables during the summer months. Joseph stood in the center, as was appropriate for the patriarch, Anna beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Their 6 children arranged around them: Dimitro, Petro, Mikhail, Vasil, Elena, and Katerina. And behind them, arranged on benches that had been brought from the house, 9 grandchildren ranging in age from 6 months to 14 years. 18 people in total. Whitmore spent nearly 20 minutes positioning everyone, adjusting angles, ensuring that faces were visible and the composition was balanced. Photography at that time required long exposures. Subjects had to remain absolutely still for several seconds, or the image would blur. "Don't move," Whitmore instructed. "Don't even breathe deeply. Just a few seconds and it will be done." He disappeared under the black cloth that covered the back of his camera, one hand on the shutter mechanism. And then something strange happened. Elena would describe it years later in a letter to a paranormal investigator, a letter that still exists in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. She wrote, "The moment before Mr. Whitmore opened the shutter, I felt something change. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder. The sounds of the children playing in the distance faded away until there was nothing but silence. Even the wind stopped, and I felt, for just a moment, as though something was watching us. Something behind the camera, something behind Mr. Whitmore, something that saw us all and was pleased." Whitmore opened the shutter. The exposure lasted 6 seconds. 6 seconds of absolute stillness. 6 seconds during which 18 people held their breath, held their poses, held themselves frozen in time. And then it was over. "Perfect," Whitmore said, emerging from beneath the cloth. "That should be excellent." The family relaxed, began to move again, to talk and laugh. The children ran off to play. The adults returned to the celebration. Food was served, toasts were made, stories were told. Joseph presided over it all with obvious pleasure, surrounded by the family he had built in this harsh land, proud of what he had accomplished despite all odds. The party continued until well after dark. By the time the last guests departed, it was nearly midnight. Joseph went to bed tired but content, his belly full of good food, his head slightly fuzzy from Slivovitz, his heart warm with the love of his family. He had no way of knowing that the photograph taken that afternoon had captured something more than just 18 smiling faces. It had captured their deaths. Samuel Whitmore returned to Pittsburgh that evening and developed the glass plate negative in his darkroom the following day. What he saw made him drop the plate, shattering it against the stone floor of his studio. According to his journal, discovered after his own death in 1927 and donated to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh by his widow, Whitmore wrote, "I have been a photographer for 23 years. I have taken thousands of portraits, developed countless plates. I have never seen anything like what appeared on the Kovalenko family photograph. I cannot explain it. I will not try. I only know that I wish I had never traveled to Windham Hollow, had never pointed my camera at that family, had never captured what I captured." He continued, "In the photograph, surrounding the family like spectators at a performance, there are shadows, not ordinary shadows cast by trees or buildings. These are figures, 9 distinct figures, barely visible, like smoke given form. They stand behind the family, looming over them, and each figure seems to be reaching toward one specific person in the photograph, as though selecting them, marking them." Whitmore was so disturbed that he almost didn't deliver the photographs to the family. He made prints from a second negative that he had taken immediately after the first, a backup, as was his standard practice. That second negative showed nothing unusual, just a family portrait, 18 people smiling at the camera, frozen in a moment of happiness. But the first negative, the first one, he destroyed it, ground the glass to powder and scattered it in the Allegheny River. He delivered only the photographs made from the second, normal negative. The Kovalenko family received their photographs 2 weeks later, in early November. They were beautiful, clear, welcome, posed, exactly what they had hoped for. Joseph had one framed and hung it in the front room of his house, a place of pride where visitors could see it immediately upon entering. Anna had copies made for each of her children. They hung them in their own homes, treasured mementos of that perfect October day. And then the deaths began. The first was Mikhail, Joseph's third son, 30, 2 years old, married with 2 young children. He worked as a shaft foreman in the Black Seam mine, a position of responsibility that he had earned through 15 years of hard work and steady competence. On November 27, 1911, exactly 5 weeks after the photograph was taken, Mikhail was supervising a crew in Tunnel 7, 800 feet below the surface. They were extending the tunnel, pushing deeper into a coal seam that had proven exceptionally rich. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the mountain moved, a cave-in, sudden and catastrophic. Thousands of tons of rock collapsed, crushing everything in its path. 5 men died instantly, including Mikhail. Their bodies weren't recovered for 3 days, and when they were finally pulled from the rubble, they were barely recognizable as human. The family grieved, the community grieved. Death was no stranger to Windham Hollow, but it never became easier to accept. Mikhail was buried in the company cemetery on the hill, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross. Joseph aged 10 years and 10 days. The light in his eyes dimmed, but he carried on, as miners always did, because there was no choice. Life in the hollow didn't pause for grief. 2 months passed, and then the second death came. Little Yuri was 6 years old, the youngest son of Dimitro, Joseph's eldest child. He was a bright boy, quick to laugh, curious about everything. He loved to explore the woods behind the town, collecting interesting stones and watching the squirrels prepare for winter. On January 19, 1912, Yuri developed a fever. Nothing unusual. Children got sick frequently in the crowded, coal, dust-choked environment of the mining town. His mother, Olna, put him to bed with cool compresses and spoonfuls of honey water. The fever worsened. By the second day, Yuri was delirious, burning up despite all efforts to cool him. His breath came in short, painful gasps. A red rash spread across his chest and neck. Scarlet fever, the doctor diagnosed when he finally arrived from the next town over. Highly contagious, often fatal, especially in young children. Yuri died on January 23rd, 4 days after the first symptoms appeared. He died in his mother's arms, struggling for breath until the very end, his small body consumed by fever. He was the second person from the photograph to die. The family was devastated. 2 deaths in less than 3 months. But such tragedies, while heartbreaking, were not unheard of in communities like Windham Hollow. Mining accidents and childhood diseases were constant threats. No one yet saw a pattern that changed in March. Vasil, Joseph's youngest son at 27, worked as a breaker boy supervisor, one of the few above-ground positions in the mine operation. He managed the boys, some as young as 8 or 9, who sat at sorting tables separating coal from slate and stone, their small, quick fingers essential to the process. It was dangerous work. The machinery was unforgiving. Every year, boys lost fingers, hands, sometimes worse. On March 12, 1912, Vasil was inspecting one of the breaker machines, checking for mechanical issues that had been causing delays. He climbed onto the sorting platform to get a better view, leaning over the conveyor belt to examine the gears beneath. His foot slipped. He fell forward, his arm plunging into the machinery before anyone could react. The gears caught his sleeve, his hand, his arm, pulling him in with inexorable mechanical force. The machine was shut down within seconds, but the damage was done. Vasil's arm was mangled beyond recognition, crushed and torn from shoulder to fingertips. The company doctor, more experienced with traumatic injuries than any hospital surgeon, amputated the arm immediately, there in the breaker house, using a saw and whiskey as anesthesia. Vasil survived the amputation, but died 3 days later from infection and blood loss. His last words, according to the priest who administered last rites, were, "It's waiting for all of us. I can see them now, the shadows from the photograph. They're here." The priest, Father Dominik Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had served the Windham Hollow community for 15 years, was disturbed enough by Vasil's dying ravings that he visited the Kovalenko home. The day after the funeral, he asked to see the family photograph. Joseph brought it down from the wall. Father Kowalski studied it for long minutes, his face growing increasingly pale. Finally, he crossed himself and stepped back. "How many have died?" he asked. "3. Joseph said, his voice hollow. "My son Mikhail, my grandson Yuri, my son Vasil. 3 from this photograph," Father Kowalski said slowly. "All within 5 months of it being taken. You think there's a connection?" Anna asked from the doorway, her voice sharp with the fear she'd been trying to suppress. The priest hesitated. I think you should burn this photograph. I think you should burn all copies of it, and you should pray for protection." But Joseph didn't burn the photograph. He was a practical man, a man who had survived 32 years in America through hard work and logic. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in accidents, in disease, in the random cruelty of an uncaring universe. "My sons died because the mine is dangerous and children get sick," he told Father Kowalski firmly. Not because of a photograph. The priest left without pressing the matter. But he noted the incident in his personal journal, a leather-bound book where he recorded the spiritual life of his parish. That journal still exists, archived in the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh. In it, Father Kowalski wrote, "Joseph Kovalenko is a good man, but he is stubborn. He cannot see what should be obvious, that something unnatural has attached itself to his family. I fear for them. I fear for them all. His fear was justified. The fourth death came in May. Katerina, Joseph's younger daughter, 34 years old, mother of 3. She had always been robust, healthy, one of those fortunate people who seemed immune to the various ailments that plagued the mining community. On May 8, 1912, she complained of a headache. By evening, the headache had become excruciating. By midnight, she was unconscious. A cerebral hemorrhage, the doctor said. A blood vessel in her brain had simply burst, flooding her skull with blood. There was nothing to be done. She died without regaining consciousness, leaving behind a husband and 3 children under the age of 10. 4 deaths, 4 people from the photograph, all dead within 7 months. The family could no longer deny that something was wrong. Elena, Joseph's youngest daughter, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. She gathered the family, those who remained, in Joseph's house 2 days after Katerina's funeral. "We need to talk about the photograph," she said. The room fell silent. 4 of us have died. Elena continued, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. 4 people from that photograph, all since October. That's not coincidence. That's not normal. Petro, the second eldest son, shook his head. "You're suggesting the photograph is cursed. That's superstitious nonsense." "Is it?" Elena pulled out a copy of the photograph, laying it on the table. "Look at it, really look at it." They gathered around, studying the image that they had seen countless times but never truly examined. And there, when you looked closely, when you let your eyes relax and see beyond the obvious composition, there was something. Not in every copy of the photograph, only in some. The ones made from that first negative before it was destroyed. Something in the shadows, something in the background that shouldn't be there. Shapes, almost human but not quite. Barely visible, like smoke given form, exactly as Samuel Whitmore had described in his journal. 9 shapes. "Mother of God," Dimitro whispered. They decided to burn the photographs, all of them, every copy they could find. It took 2 days to gather them all. Photographs from each child's home, the framed portrait from Joseph's wall, the copies that had been given to friends. They piled them in the backyard and set them alight, watching as the paper curled and blackened, as the faces of their family vanished into ash and smoke. Joseph stood apart from the burning, his face carved from stone. He still didn't believe, not really. But he was willing to humor his family, to let them have their ritual if it brought them comfort. Anna stood beside him, gripping his arm, her lips moving in silent prayer. The photographs burned, but it was too late. The curse, if that's what it was, had already been set in motion. The mechanism had been triggered. The deaths would continue until the tally was complete. 9 shadows in the background. 9 deaths to come. The 5th death came just 3 weeks after they burned the photographs. Anna, Joseph's wife of 29 years, 6 years old. She had survived childbirth 6 times, had endured the harsh conditions of mining life, had buried 3 of her children and 1 grandchild. She was strong, resilient, the foundation upon which the family had been built. On June 2, 1912, she simply didn't wake up. Joseph found her in the morning, lying beside him in the bed they had shared for nearly 3 decades. She looked peaceful, as though she were simply sleeping, but she was cold, had been dead for hours, the doctor estimated. Heart failure, probably, quick and painless, a mercy, some said, but to Joseph it was the final, unbearable blow. He broke at Anna's funeral. This man, who had survived the crossing from Ukraine, who had worked in the depths of the earth for 26 years, who had endured injury and hardship and loss, he finally broke. He wept openly as they lowered Anna into the ground, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "Why," he cried out, his voice echoing across the cemetery, "why is this happening to us?" No one had an answer. The pattern, once seen, could not be unseen. Every death came approximately 6 to 8 weeks after the previous one. Methodical, precise, as though following a schedule. The family that remained lived in terror, waiting to see who would be next. In August, it was Petro's daughter, Sophia, 13 years old. She drowned in the creek behind the town, a shallow stream where children had played safely for generations. She had been an excellent swimmer. The creek was only 3 feet deep at its deepest point, but somehow she had drowned. Face down in the water, her lungs full, her eyes open and staring at nothing. 6 deaths. In October, exactly 1 year after the photograph was taken, Dimitro, the eldest son, collapsed while walking to work. A stroke, sudden and massive. He was dead before he hit the ground. He was only 42 years old. 7 deaths. By this point, the story of the cursed photograph had spread beyond Wyndham Hollow. Newspapers picked it up. First the local papers, then larger publications. The curse of the Kovalenko family. Read one headline: "Photograph of death claims 7th victim," proclaimed another. Reporters came to interview the survivors. Paranormal investigators arrived, eager to study what they claimed was proof of supernatural forces. Spiritualists offered their services, promising to lift the curse for appropriate fees. Joseph refused them all. He had become a ghost himself, a hollow man who moved through life without really living. He rarely spoke. He no longer went to the mine. The company had given him a small pension, recognizing that he was broken beyond repair. He spent his days sitting in his house, staring at the wall where the photograph had once hung. Elena tried to care for him, but there was nothing she could do. Her father was waiting. They were all waiting. In December of 1912, Petro died. He had been working in the mine, same as his brother Mikhail, same as his father before him. A routine day, a routine task. He was setting timber supports in a new tunnel when one of the beams simply gave way, crushed him instantly. 8 deaths, 8 people from the photograph, 1 shadow remained. The family knew, with absolute certainty, who would be next. There was only one person left who could complete the pattern. Only one person whose death would satisfy whatever dark force had been awakened that October day in 1911. Joseph Kovalenko himself. He knew it too. He welcomed it. On February 14, 1913, Valentine's Day of all days, Joseph Kovalenko walked to the Black Seam mine. He hadn't been inside in months, but the guards recognized him and let him pass. He was Joseph Kovalenko, one of the original miners, a man who had given his life to the mountain. He descended into the mine alone, walking the familiar tunnels with the confidence of someone who knew every turn, every shaft, every dangerous passage. He walked down to Tunnel 7, where his son Mikhail had died, down to the deepest point in the mine, 800 feet below the surface. And there, in the darkness, he sat down against the stone wall and closed his eyes. They found him 3 days later, when someone finally thought to look for him. He was sitting exactly as he had been when he died, his back against the wall, his hands folded in his lap. There was no sign of what had killed him, no injury, no obvious cause. His heart had simply stopped. The 9th death, the curse was complete. The story of the Kovalenko family spread across the country in the years that followed. It became one of the most famous and most controversial paranormal cases of the early 20th century. Skeptics argued that it was nothing more than tragic coincidence, a series of random deaths made to seem connected by grief and superstition, and the human need to find patterns in chaos. But those who had been there, who had seen the photograph before it was burned, who had watched 9 people die in precise succession, they knew different. Elena Kovalenko, the youngest daughter, was one of only 3 survivors from that photograph. She lived until 1987, dying at the age of 94. In her final years, she gave several interviews about the cursed photograph, always insisting that it had been real, that the curse had been real, that something unnatural had claimed her family. "I saw the shadows," she would say. "In that photograph behind us, I saw them. 9 shadows for 9 deaths, and they came for us, one by one, exactly as they had marked us." Samuel Whitmore, the photographer, never took another portrait after the Kovalenko photograph. He switched to landscape photography exclusively, taking pictures of empty mountains and deserted streets, places where no human faces could be captured. He died in 1927, his journal hidden away until after his death, his widow finding it and reading about the horror he had witnessed in his darkroom that November day. The glass plate negative that Whitmore destroyed, the first one, the one that showed the shadows, was never recovered. The second negative, the normal one from which all the surviving prints were made, was donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1953. It resides there still in a climate-controlled vault, carefully preserved. But people who have studied it, who have examined it closely under various lighting conditions, report that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, if you look at it in just the right way, you can still see them, the shadows, 9 shapes, barely visible, hovering around the family like vultures circling dying prey. Windham Hollow itself no longer exists. The Black Seam Mine closed in 1947, exhausted of coal after 62 years of operation. The company town was gradually abandoned, its buildings left to decay, its residents dispersing to find work elsewhere. By 1960, it was a ghost town. By 1980, it had been swallowed by the expansion of Pittsburgh's suburbs, paved over and built upon, its history largely forgotten. The cemetery where Joseph and Anna and their children are buried is still there, though difficult to find, overgrown and hidden behind a strip mall and a parking lot. The wooden crosses that once marked most of the graves have long since rotted away. Only the few stone markers remain, weathered and covered with moss, their inscriptions barely legible. But on certain nights, particularly in October, when the anniversary of that fatal photograph approaches, people who live near the old cemetery report strange things. Shadows that move without any source, cold spots that have no explanation, the sound of weeping carried on the wind. And sometimes, they say, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can see them. 9 figures, transparent as smoke, standing among the graves. Waiting, always waiting. The question that haunted investigators for decades, the question that remains unanswered to this day, is simple. Why? Why the Kovalenko family? What had they done to deserve such a curse? Were they truly cursed at all? Or was it simply the cruelest coincidence ever documented? Some paranormal researchers have suggested that the photograph somehow opened a door, created a connection between our world and something else. That the camera, at that specific moment in time, at that specific place, captured not just light, but something more fundamental, something hungry. Others believe that Joseph Kovalenko, in his long years working deep in the earth, had disturbed something ancient, that the mountain itself had claimed the family as payment for the coal they had taken from its depths. Still, others think it was nothing supernatural at all, just 9 deaths spread over 14 months in a community where death was commonplace, a statistical anomaly made tragic by grief and transformed into legend by fear. But Elena Kovalenko, in one of her last interviews before her death, offered a different explanation. One that sends chills down the spine even now, nearly a century later. "We were marked," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her aged eyes distant with memory. "The moment that shutter opened, the moment that light touched the plate, we were marked. I felt it then, even though I didn't understand it. Something saw us, something chose us, and once we were chosen, there was no escape. The photograph didn't cause the deaths. It simply showed us what was already coming. It was a warning we couldn't read until it was too late." She paused, staring at something only she could see. "The curse wasn't in the photograph," she said finally. "The curse was being seen." The story of the Kovalenko family remains a disturbing reminder that there are some things we may never fully understand, mysteries that resist rational explanation, no matter how hard we try to fit them into the comfortable frameworks of coincidence and probability. But questions remain, mysteries that haunt those who study this case. Why were 9 people marked? Why not all 18 who appeared in the photograph? What made those 9 different from the others? Elena survived, as did 2 of her nephews who had been in the photograph. Why were they spared when so many others were claimed? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what happened to the other copies of the photograph, the ones that were distributed before the family realized what was happening? Whitmore made at least 30 prints from that negative. The family recovered and burned perhaps 20. What happened to the rest? Are they still out there, hidden in attics and storage boxes, hanging on walls in homes whose occupants have no idea what they possess? To this day, in the archives of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, researchers occasionally request access to the Kovalenko photograph negative. The archivists have become reluctant to grant such access. Too many researchers have reported disturbing experiences. Feelings of being watched, unexplained cold spots in the climate, controlled examination room, equipment malfunctions. One researcher in 2003 claimed to have seen movement in the photograph, shadows shifting position when she wasn't looking directly at them. The society now requires anyone examining the negative to sign a liability waiver. They've installed additional cameras in the examination room, though the footage they capture is often corrupted, filled with static and strange anomalies. And on the anniversary of that October day in 1911, when the photograph was first taken, the archives remain closed. No access granted, no exceptions, because some things, perhaps, are better left unseen. Some images are too dangerous to look upon. Some moments in time should never have been captured at all. And on silent nights, when the wind moves through the overgrown cemetery where the Kovalenko family rests, people still report seeing them. 9 figures among the tombstones, transparent as smoke, holding poses as if waiting for a photographer who will never come. They stand frozen, just as they stood on that October day more than a century ago, captured forever in a moment that became their doom. The shadows are patient. They're always patient, and somewhere out there, in an attic or a storage unit, in an old album or a forgotten box, copies of that photograph may still exist, waiting to be found, waiting to be looked upon, waiting to mark 9 more souls for death. If you ever come across an old family photograph from 1911, a group portrait of Ukrainian immigrants in a Pennsylvania mining town, study it carefully before you look at it. Check the shadows, check the background, look for shapes that shouldn't be there, for figures that have no right to exist. And if you see them, the 9 shadows, the 9 marks of deaths, put the photograph down, walk away, don't look back, because some images, once seen, cannot be unseen, and some curses, once activated, cannot be stopped. If this journey through one of the most disturbing supernatural mysteries in American history resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between coincidence and curse, between rational explanation and inexplicable horror, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, darkness that needs to be brought into the light. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on this question. Can photographs capture more than just light? Can they trap something of the soul, something of the spirit, something that exists beyond our ordinary perception? Have you ever felt uneasy looking at an old photograph? Have you ever sensed something wrong in an image, something you couldn't quite identify, but that filled you with inexplicable dread? Share your experiences, share your stories, because in the shadows between what we know and what we fear, truth and legend often become indistinguishable. Until next time, remember, not all darkness exists in the absence of light. Sometimes, the darkest things are those we capture and preserve forever, frozen in silver nitrate and regret. Keep questioning, keep searching, and be careful what you photograph. Some moments should never be preserved.